I call the Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to speak on the government's carbon tax repeal bills. This parliament's response to how we handle climate change will either help or hinder the future of this country. It will define if the 44th Parliament of Australia is either willing to look forward or backwards. We will define in this parliament, with how we vote on this legislation, the generation of parliamentarians to our children and our grandchildren. The scientists know that carbon pollution is changing our weather and it's harming our environment. The Australian public knows. They know it when they experience more and more extreme weather events. Economists know that carbon pollution will hurt our economy. And the public and the Labor Party know it is the responsibility of Parliament to reduce the amount of carbon pollution that is going and being emitted into our environment. This is why Labor will always support laws which tackle the issues of the future, which will reduce carbon pollution. This is why we cannot today, or in any day forward, support Tony Abbott's laws, which would leave Australia with no effective means of cutting carbon pollution. Greenhouse gas emissions caused by human activity are having an adverse effect on our environment and on our economy. If we refuse to tackle the problems, if we put our heads in the sand, if we say that we will put off to the future how we deal with environmental, economic issues, then we mark ourselves down in future history to judge what we did at this time in this place when we had another course of action. The latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has confirmed that the world is warming, due in part to the burning of fossil fuels. Across the globe, from 2001 to 2010, this was the warmest decade on record. I repeat, 2001 to 2010, it was the warmest decade on record. And indeed, every decade since the 1940s, is warmer than the one before. Labor's concerned that our farmers and primary producers will experience a decline in irrigated agriculture in the Murray-Darling Basin. Labor is concerned that we will see a decline in our wheat production. Labor is concerned that we will see a decline in our wine grape production. Our world is approaching a population of 7 billion people. The threats from a changing climate intensify, not diminish, our need to act. Labor understands that there are businesses with foresight who are already ahead of the climate change curve, moving ahead to capture the technologies of the future, to capture the business opportunities of the future. My position and that of Labor is perfectly clear. We will take action to reduce the amount of carbon pollution being emitted into our environment. But those opposite, led by Tony Abbott, do not believe in climate change and its adverse impact upon the environment. Labor will always make its decisions on policies in this parliament based on the best available science. That's the Labor way. Yet those opposite, led by Tony Abbott, despite the best available science, are prepared to tear down everything which has been accomplished in tackling climate change up to this day. We on this side of the House are like millions of Australians. We know that Australians expect their members of parliament not to sit idly by and say that the future is too hard to deal with, to say that Australia cannot compete with the rest of the world, to say that Australia cannot reform and change and grasp the opportunities of the future. That is not the Labor way. What I simply cannot understand is why those opposite cannot understand the future. No one seriously, or at least no one serious, believes that we don't have an issue with increasing levels of carbon pollution. Today, in the legislation we're seeing being debated, Tony Abbott is lining up with the militia of climate change denialists, and he is taking the coalition government with him. The Prime Minister is ensuring his place in history and the place of everyone on that side of the parliament will put them on the wrong side of history. The Prime Minister is saying to Australians, people of Australia, carbon pollution in our atmosphere is just a political problem, and it is one, therefore, that Australians do not need to act on. If the Prime Minister was a doctor and the patient was sick, all I could imagine is he would say to people, that patient, don't change anything. It's really hard to change. It may involve making decisions about the future which in your long-term interest, but today you might find difficult. That is not the Labor way. In Parliament, the people who put us here expect us not to do everything for them, not to be in every household, not to regulate every aspect of their lives, but they do expect their leaders, regardless if they're coalition or Labor, to at least try and explain to Australians to navigate a path to the future. These 11 bits of legislation, they are not a map to the future. They are an exercise in the rear vision mirror, looking back and doing nothing. The Treasury, in its Blue Book, prepared prior to the 2010 election, said, and I quote, "A market-based mechanism can achieve the necessary abatement at a cost per tonne of emissions far lower than any other alternative direct action policies." Say what you like about the carbon tax, and many have. This government is not just repealing the carbon tax. This legislation kills any possibility of limiting carbon pollution pouring into our atmosphere. There are 11 carbon tax repeal bills before the Parliament today. The government's bills on climate change represent the unilateral disarmament of the nation's defences to deal with climate change, in leaving nothing behind, no other sound or sensible replacement policy. The Abbott government has run up the white flag on climate change. It has surrendered its responsibility to the nation. It has said, it declares in this legislation that this government finds the future too hard, that this government cannot navigate a path to the future, that this government will tell everyone that they can stay as they are, that there is no need to change, that it'll always be blue sky, and that regardless of the science, regardless of the innate knowledge of Australians, that the best option is to do nothing. The fundamental problem with the government's approach is that there is no limit on how much carbon pollution will be allowed in Australia. Put simply, this government is saying there will be no cap on emissions. What it means is that this government has no idea about how to control carbon emissions and that any amount is acceptable. Surely it is a proper role for government to lead and to set standards about how much carbon pollution should be allowed. That is a legitimate function of government. It is that leadership that people expect. Tony Abbott's view, and those of his denialist cohorts, is that there should be no cap. There should be no cap, no standard set on carbon emissions into the future. And even if genuine reductions can be purchased by polluters, there is nothing in the Prime Minister's plan to stop emissions increasing elsewhere in the economy. This leads to the other flaw in the legislation. Not only do they have no cap, but what they will do is make mum and dad taxpayers in Australia pay their hard-earned taxes to large polluters, and that is the only idea they have. This is the climate change policy from central casting if you are a closet climate change sceptic. There is everything you could want in the coalition policies if you don't believe climate change is real. There is no cap on emissions. There is money to be paid to people who emit carbon. And then when we look at this policy, he won't even try and make companies with large carbon emissions accountable. Leaders across the rest of the world are willing to act. They are acting in different ways, but they accept the science. Real leaders take real action. On Friday, British Prime Minister David Cameron, who had a busy weekend, has said, "I am not a scientist, But it always seems to me that one of the strongest arguments about climate change is even if you are 90% certain, or 80% certain, or 70% certain, or 60% certain, if you thought there was a 60% chance your house might burn down, you would buy some insurance. Yeah. Real leaders are not denialists. Real leaders have the courage to tell people things that they don't always want to hear. Real leaders have the courage to say to people, we will take you on a path to the future, and this involves accepting real facts. Real leaders choose to prepare their nations for the future rather than leave it for others in the future to do what the current generation would not do. This is why the Abbott government's response on climate change is a defining issue for our parliament and our nation. It represents the well-known coalition disregard for science. It demonstrates their willingness to put short-term politics ahead of long-term national interest. It is symbolic of their willingness to bring up the drawbridge for Australia and say the rest of the world is a confronting and difficult place, and we will simply try and reassure Australians that if we ignore the rest of the world, then the rest of the world will simply go away. They will risk my children and your children's economic and environmental well-being by their refusal to act on the science. That they will conveniently ignore inconvenient truths is no surprise. What a marvellous scientific set of achievements this government's assembled in a brief 2 months. No Minister for Science, the first since 1931. No Climate Change Commission, no Climate Change Authority. Quarter of the staff at the CSIRO, they get it in the back. They get it in the neck. Shame. This government and this Prime Minister has never seen an expert that he is not willing to censor, to cut or contradict. In his own words, indeed, if he can't contradict, censor or cut them, he will just eject them. He has said that the climate change is absolute crap. No serious government, no serious leader says these things. No serious leader rebuts serious economists and tells them that they're all wrong. Their direct action policy is a vagrant policy with no visible means of support, no economist support. And Prime Minister, it is not enough in Australia. You cannot plant your trees out of this problem. There is not enough land in Australia, not enough trees, not enough arborists and not enough water to water all these trees to plant your way out of climate change. In dismantling climate change action in Australia, this government and this legislation undermines our future. Also, their direct action policy. What a sham. Why should every Australian household pay $1,200 a year merely because the coalition is too lazy to accept the science in front of them? This mob opposite, they can always tell you what they will cut. They're good at cutting. But they can never tell you what to create with a vision of Australia. That is the difference between Labor and the government. They would ignore climate change and take no action. Now, the member for Port Adelaide will be moving our amendments to these bills. We will ensure that the defences against climate change remain in place and not weaken our efforts. Our amendments will replace the carbon tax with a role for government that says we've got to put in place a legal cap on carbon pollution and then let business, the mighty engine room of the Australian economy, we trust the private sector to work out how to handle climate change. This mob opposite just want to use taxpayer money to deny the science. We will vote with the government to repeal the price on carbon, but only if those opposite can convince us that they will genuinely fight climate change. And there is nothing in this legislation to make us see any evidence of any fight against climate change. Mr Deputy Speaker, climate change is real. We will stand together with the Australian nation. We will not defer to our future generations' problems that we could deal with now. Labor, when it's faced with the hard choice of making a decision or not making a decision, of tackling pollution or not tackling pollution, we will stand up and be counted. Under Labor, wind power trebled. Under Labor, 1 million houses have solar power. Under Labor, 24,000 jobs created, hundreds of new small businesses. I'm proud that we're sticking to our guns. I'm proud we're sticking to our principles and holding the government to account. We will not and never be a rubber stamp for this government. We will honour our commitment to the national interest. We will honour our international obligations. We can look our children in the face and say when we had the chance to do something, we did. The government's policy is toxic, the government's legislation is toxic, and Labor will never vote for toxic laws undermining the future of this country.
Yeah.